And I'm particularly pleased to be part of this inspiring program. The theme this year is religious pluralism at a time of polarization. And I'm actually going to focus on that as an example of the role of religion in public life and try to probe both the polarization and the religious pluralism issues here. But that this lectureship bears the name of Amos Jordan makes it especially meaningful to you. I've learned a lot about him from Brett, and what a timely target. Is that, you guys are not hearing clearly? You're okay, all right. In the ebb and flow of history, there come moments when we arrive at a crossroads. The future of generations to come will be shaped by the path that we choose to follow. Sometimes the implication of the choice of which path it will be are obvious. For others, only in hindsight do we see the implications of having chose amongst the diverging roads with stunning clarity. And in so many ways, we sense today that we are at such a crossroads. I imagine that every generation has believed that the problems they face were more dangerous, more perilous, more urgent than those of any generation before them. The only difference between their view on that and ours is that they were wrong and we're right. It is the state of technology that makes this such a distinctively extraordinary moment in history, in which the consequences of bad decisions are more dangerous and perilous than humanity has ever known. Compounding the urgent choices is a recognition, indeed the fear, that we may be living at the first moment in all of human history in which we can no longer afford to make the mistakes we have made from time immemorial and still learn from them. It is almost as though all of history was a dry run for this moment, and this time it counts. We have always known, for example, the ravages of warfare and the moral challenges of deciding when the use of force may be justified, but we have never faced military technologies that, if misused, could destroy the world as we know it. We've always faced the threat of pollution to our water and air and the concomitant responsibility to protect the creation that God has entrusted to our stewardship and care, but not when matched with the prospect of climate change, ravaged rainforests, rising sea levels, escalating eradication of whole species of life, overpopulation, which together threaten to irrevocably alter the climate of the entire Earth. We've always experienced intrusions into our privacy, repression of our free speech, persecution of our religious lives, but not when matched with the technology that can make Orwell's nightmare of 1984 the reality of the world. We've always lived with the reality of economic injustice. Some of the Bible's most common laws deal with protecting the poor, the stranger, the vulnerable, but never when growing inequality, globalization, technological disruptions to almost every sector of the economy portend enormous opportunities, yet also potential moral tragedy and societal destabilization at a global scale. And we've always had the challenge of applying new technologies in an ethical or moral manner, but not when matched with genetic engineering and artificial intelligence that allows us to create new forms of life, alter human life itself. In the next few years, we will decide the path that humanity will follow in addressing these momentous issues and so many others that all of you could think of right now. Will we use our wisdom, wealth, and technology to help nations resolve their differences peacefully, or destroy the world in a nuclear holocaust? To clean up the damage to our environment and protect it for generations yet unborn, or to despoil and devastatingly contaminate it? To enhance those freedoms so essential to democracy and to allowing people to find spiritual fulfillment in accordance with their consciences, or to degrade, diminish, and deny those freedoms? To share God's wealth equitably and fairly with all God's children, or to deny justice to the billions living in severe poverty and to ignore the warning of the Talmud 2,000 years ago at the time that Jesus of Nazareth taught that the sword enters the world because of justice delayed and justice denied. Will we use genetic engineering to cure birth defects or create Hitler's master race? Somebody will decide. And one more. In the 20th century, almost every great social achievement, and I understand there are people in this room who may have different views, and I respect that. Good moral people of good conscience that may have different views on some of these issues. But the labor rights movement, social security, civil rights, women's rights, environmental protections, food stamps, Medicare, all those and so many more happened because of a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill and multiracial, multi-religious, bipartisan coalitions in cities and towns across America. The hyperpartisanship of this era, arguably the worst since the Civil War, endangers our ability to act before it is too late in confronting the dangers I describe, and so many more. Will we find a way to restore civil discourse, comity, bipartisan cooperation in addressing these challenges? Or are we truly seeing the age of democracy passing as an aberration in the pattern of autocratic rule that has marked most of human history? Look, in the lifetimes of many of us, we have smashed the atom, cracked the genetic code, pierced the veil of outer space, placed the corpus of human knowledge at the fingertips of billions. In a world in which you can do anything, what you should do, the moral question, becomes the fundamental challenge facing humanity. And on that question, the religious communities of the world have urgent, profound, indispensable wisdom to offer. But for us to be effective in such endeavors, it requires the religious freedom to do so. It requires multi-faith cooperation so that we can geometrically expand the influence and impact that any one group could provide alone, and it requires a sense of religious pluralism and comity that defies the polarization that plagues our nation and so many other nations across the globe. A few comments on the state of religious freedom in the world today. In a nation founded by refugees who had fled religious persecution, religious freedom was essential to the founding of America. The free exercise and establishment clauses enshrined in our Bill of Rights, taken together with Article 6 of the Constitution, which bans any religious test for office, form the legal bedrock of our religious freedom regime. Over the past 2 centuries, we've built a system that protects the rights of religious believers and non-believers alike to worship, practice, teach, preach, share, change, express their beliefs freely. Religious freedom has been a foundation of American values and of our success as a nation, just as it is a vital component of our foreign policy today. The United States promulgated a radically new vision of the implications of what religious freedom meant in public life, particularly in the mid-20th century as the Supreme Court expanded in our understanding of religious freedom and the Establishment Clause. At the same time, in the mid-century, 2 key international documents drew from the vision of America's ideas of religious freedom and set them forth as fundamental human rights on a global level: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Protecting religious freedom is vital, not only because it enables individuals to exercise a human right, but it also serves as a driver of peace, security, development. It is instrumentally important in forging a better world. Moreover, no nation can fulfill its potential when its people are denied their right to express their innermost beliefs and lives peacefully in accordance with their conscience. The research by the Pew Foundation, which annually looks at the state of religious freedom on the global level, offers good news and bad news. The good news? 3/4 of the nations of the world do not have serious restrictions on religious freedom. The bad news? 1/4 do. They have restrictions either by government action or by the often violent actions of societal or outside non-state forces. Think ISIS, Boko Haram, militant Hindus in India, militant Buddhists in Myanmar, militant Jews on the West Bank, militant Christian militias in the Central African Republic. But that 25% includes many of the most populous nations of the world: China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Indonesia, a debatable inclusion on the list of those with serious restrictions. Some, like China, are equal opportunity oppressors, not only engage in genocidal activity against Uyghurs and Tibetan Buddhists, but oppressing and repressing the religious freedom of every religious group there. Altogether, nearly 80% of the world's population lives in countries where religious freedom faces repressive, often violent threats. So, too, have we seen in our own country a terrible explosion of hate groups, mostly on the right, from where most of the violence emanates, some on the left. We see hate acts against Muslims, Sikhs, Jews, gays, women in escalating numbers. We've witnessed the degradation of civil discourse, first in the dark corners of the internet, and then more publicly, exacerbated by the anonymity of social media and the stamp of approval of such rhetoric by too many leaders in our nation. And the damage such hate speech and hate crimes inflict on their victims and on America is great and requires a national response. For hate crimes are more than mere acts of violence. They're more than murders, beatings, arsons, desecrations. Hate crimes are nothing less than attacks on the values that are the pillars of our republic and the guarantors of our freedom. They are a betrayal of the promise of America. They erode our national well-being, and those who commit those crimes do so fully intending to tear at the too often frayed threads of diversity that bind us together and make us strong. They seek to divide and conquer. They seek the polarization we're discussing. They seek to tear us apart from within, pitting American against American, fomenting violence and civil discord. As Dr. King said in the wake of the Birmingham church bombing, that those 4 girls who perish, quote, have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderer. If we are to address any of the problems I've alluded to, if we are to change the world for the better, if we are to heal this broken world for ourselves and our children, 3 categories of human society must change. The first is people must change in all the ways that I'm sure you see clearly, and spiritual values that religion nurtures so often play an indispensable role in our individual redemption. Second, institutions must change. Businesses, civil society entities, economic structures, and government structures must change in ways that embrace and enhance the human dignity of every human being. And such changes begin at the local community, the subject of one of the Wheatley program's roundtables this week, and then expands out regionally, nationally, globally. And that idea of human dignity is, of course, reflected in the varied versions of the Golden Rule's call for our responsibility to every other human being, an idea found in every major faith tradition around the world, as well as being rooted in Christian and Jewish terms in the concept of being created in the image of the divine. These concepts speak to the vital role religion must play. And religion not only talks the talk about institutional transformation, but walks the walk. Think of the roles of literally the millions of religious institutions and houses of worship across the globe with their voluntary and professional social service agency, their feeding, healthcare, educational programs contributing so much to the institutional social capital that is urgently needed. And the Church of Latter-day Saints is an exemplar of such efforts. But frankly, such efforts are similarly a hallmark of most faith communities. And finally, government policies must change if we are to address the causes of injustice and inequity, the causes of deprivation and persecution, rather than only addressing the symptoms of injustice or treating the victims of unjust and inequitable structures and institutions and government policies. Religion's prophetic witness and our courage to preach truth to power, to serve as a moral code and conscience to ourselves, to our communities, to our governments, to all humanity, play a vital role in such transformation in our society. All those are manifestations of what Religion in Public Life program is all about. Religion redeeming souls. Religion providing social services to those that the Bible tells us we must be responsible for, the widow and the orphan, the aged and the children, the hungry and the ill, and being a force of justice like the prophets to the people of Israel, Moses to Pharaoh, Esther to King Ahasuerus. If Abraham can challenge God's self on behalf of the innocents of Sodom and Gomorrah, can we not play that same role in challenging wherever we see injustice, oppression, and cruelty fester? As Abraham Lincoln affirmed in his second inaugural, with malice towards none, with charity to all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. But as I said earlier, for religion to play this role in America and across the globe, it requires the religious freedom to act on the issues and the interfaith, multi-faith cooperation, recognizing that while we all have challenges we must face within our own faith communities, where we can work together in our vast numbers, we can achieve things none of us can achieve alone. And when we act together effectively, what a transformative force that can be. Now, ours is an extraordinary moment for multi-faith or interfaith relations. Think about this. Never in the history of the world has there been this degree of interfaith dialogue, interfaith structures and institutions, interfaith cooperative endeavors that we see in America and in nations across the globe. Among the goals of such endeavors are ensuring protections as recognized in international law of religious freedom for all, making all societies safe for minority faith communities, and as minority faith communities so often victimized by discrimination and hate crimes, and more positively, developing cooperative endeavors to work together to create a fairer, more just, more compassionate world based on a shared understanding of the common good. I see examples every day as faith groups stand in solidarity with those targeted by hate crimes in our country, cleaning up desecrations, standing and rebuilding, raising money to rebuild things that have been hurt, offering their houses of worship to houses of worship of other faith groups that have been damaged. And in my work as a U.S. ambassador at large for international religious freedom, I saw countless inspiring examples of often heroic interfaith cooperation, where their lives were being put on the line, where injustice festered and religious persecution endangered minority religions or all religions. Not everywhere, not every country, but it is so pervasive that its transformative potential is clear. And when people come together across political, religious, cultural lines, when they defy the polarization to build together a better America for all, they are, of course, modeling the very kind of America we hope to create. So religious freedom and cooperation are a sine qua non for transformation to happen, and that in a world where, paradoxically, religious oppression and discrimination is so rampant, polarization and divisiveness too often a counter norm to what I am describing as positive here, this makes embrace of religious pluralism more important than ever. So let me break down the range of meanings that are evoked by the use of the term religious pluralism. Often religious pluralism is contrasted to religious tolerance. The idea of tolerance of those who are different, even those you thought wrong, while never the norm, did exist over the centuries and varied times and climes in human history. The term, however, conveyed a negative connotation of standing silent in the face of evil until the age of reason, until the modern state with its key goals of ensuring civil comity and cooperation led to transforming such tolerance into a civic virtue. Indeed, as Paul Mendes Flores pointed out, the civic duty to tolerate and the moral injunction to oppose what is objectionable are often in conflict with each other. But on a human level, no one who is seen as different than others wants to be just tolerated, conveying a sense of grudging silence by those who view me as the other, the stranger, too often as a threat to the uniformity of the majority. I fully acknowledge the limitation of tolerance and strongly affirm the strong positive characteristics and impact that, in contrast, I'll discuss in a moment, of authentic, rich, deep pluralism, of covenantal pluralism that is at the heart of what we seek in terms of interfaith cooperation. But before I do, I want to defend tolerance for a moment. For I suspect that in requiring a significant commitment of time, intellectual engagement, personal and social interactions, and programmatic resources, the rich, deep pluralism we all seek may well present the best of multi-faith relations and interactions, yet may never, or at least be a long way off, as a societal norm or the way in real life most people and even many religious groups will interact with each other. Tolerance as a general norm of civility may indeed be a far more common and may remain indispensable to the well-being of societies and of religion in general and minority communities in particular. Let me just give just one example. If you look at the percentage of Americans holding anti-Semitic views since the end of World War II, here until 2000, the percentage fell by about 50% during that time, primarily driven by increasing levels of education in America, testifying to the impact that civic education can have in America, another of this year's roundtable as part of the program this week. Yet still, it meant 30 to 40 million people, even now, and more before the rates began to go down, continue to hold anti-Semitic attitudes. But of those tens of millions over the last 70 years, in the main, America's cultural constraints of tolerance, even among those not involved at all in interfaith efforts, not in many of them ever having met a Jew here, nonetheless protected the Jewish community from a lot of the hate that I am talking about. And other minorities as well were protected. Indeed, in the post-World War II era, we've seen Jews move from the peripheries of American society to the very center of American academic, professional, political, economic life here. And I suspect that many minority groups are protected by that tolerance. So just a word of defending tolerance as a mode of advancing from oppression and repression to where we want to be. As our friends Chris Seipel and Dennis Hoover and Templeton's Christopher Stewart argue in their call for covenantal pluralism, they acknowledge in our fast globalizing world of ever-growing diversity, tolerance remains certainly necessary as a general norm of civility. And there are important international human rights documents dedicated to defending tolerance, such as the United States Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Tolerance and Discrimination based on religious belief. Still, tolerance is in and of itself, they said, not sufficient for the challenge of living well with deep diversity. What I'm suggesting is that we don't think of tolerance and pluralism, we see a spectrum. Tolerance and different forms of tolerance here, morphing into different forms of pluralism there. In the end, tolerance, if it consists only of begrudging acceptance of those who are different, does little to overcome fears, alienation, misunderstanding, suspicions, all of these creating a fertile field of polarizing divisiveness when faced with strains and crises in our society. It may maintain civil tranquility for a while when things in a society are going well, but it offers little, if any, resiliency against those who seek to play on the fears and frustration of one group against another for their own political, economic, or social gains. Of forms of tolerance, the great German poet Goethe once wrote, "To tolerate is to insult. Tolerance must only be preparatory to open the way to mutual acceptance. True liberalism," he said, "is acknowledgement and understanding." In today's terms, hopefully tolerance will be preparatory for a commitment to a more robust religious pluralism, a gateway to that pluralism. Now, there are differing forms of pluralism that arise. One is the pluralism embodying the concept of religious freedom as a human right. Well, our Declaration of Independence rooted our unalienable rights as being endowed in us by our Creator. Neither our Constitution, nor most democratic constitutions, nor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, nor the ICCPR grounded our rights, including our religious freedom rights, in anything other than secular terms. In the Constitution, God is not mentioned. Well, actually, trivia question for you. God's mentioned once in the Constitution. Anyone know where in the Constitution it's found? In the year of our Lord, 1787. This humanistic approach at its core affirmed vital, indispensable elements of religious freedom and pluralism, most particularly the guarantee that one's rights as a citizen of their country should never depend on that person's religious identity, beliefs, or peaceful practices. Let me say that again, because if we achieve this goal and nothing else, it would be such a major advance forward, and without this goal, changing societal and personal attitudes will never be sufficient. One's rights, no one's rights, as a citizen in their country, should ever depend on that person's religious identity, beliefs, or peaceful practices. Now, we're living through a time when various schools of thought attack the schema of human rights and religious freedom from the left and the right, challenging whether these universal human rights norms are actually universal, or whether or not the entire schema is a form of Western cultural and intellectual imperialism imposing so-called norms that, in fact, are culture-bound to the West, or in terms of religious freedom, an effort of Western religions to proselytize those who live in other areas of the world. Critics from other countries argue that these ideas are not rooted in their faith or cultural or political traditions, and yet they are forced to accept such so-called universal norms even where they disagree. This is just one of the reasons why BYU's distinguished iclars and other actors in the field of international religious freedom are pushing the issue of human dignity as represented in the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everyone, Everywhere, which iclars helped shape and played a vital role in shaping. In focusing on a widely shared moral and faith belief, a shared concept that avoids the rights folks' language as the frame that is generating pushback these days, even though the central thrust of the dignity frame is that lifting up the principle of human dignity inevitably leads to the protection of core human rights. One limitation of the humanistic approach to religious pluralism is its difficulty in recognizing the legitimacy of faith claims that are revealed claims. If it has to be justified in secular terms, how do you justify revealed claims in public life? This approach tends to tilt the balance against revealed religious freedom claims that conflict with other calls to human rights claims, including civil rights claims of protected categories, a debate of significant polarization in American life today. The question of when there can be exemptions as a religious right claim against following civil rights laws. I happen to lean on the side of protecting the schema of civil rights. If there were a blanket religious exemption here that anyone could make the entire structure of civil rights protections would fall. On the other hand, amongst people who hold that view, the approach of some on the left, on the liberal wing of this, on the pro-civil rights end of this, that you shouldn't allow for religious claims to be made where they would damage civil rights claims, I think is absolutely wrong. And the religious rights claims are as important to be put into the balance here in ways being far more generous about how to accommodate religious claims so long as the civil rights claims are being protected. We all need to be open to whether or not we can find some compromise and common ground. The Utah Compromise was a great example of a good faith effort to make progress there that hopefully will spur other states, other localities, the nation to think through these issues themselves. One limitation, another form of pluralism is rooted in a relativism that says, hey, my faith claims work for me, yours work for you, don't bother me with them. We'll just work together. I do what I want, you do what you want, and we'll just work together wherever we can. We don't need to raise concerns about competing truth claims. But there may be profound theological differences that are troubling to dialogical partners with the intended need to understand those claims, understand our fears, to discuss, convey our views on those claims. And when those claims get applied to public policy decisions, there may be even more divisive views on these issues. If you ignore them, these will fester and tear coalitions apart. There has to be a way to dialogically confront them in an I-thou, to use Martin Buber's terminology, way of love and openness and full embrace of the equal humanity that permeates those who hold differing views from us. A variant of this approach focuses on the lowest common denominator, common ground kind of effort. I alluded to a couple before. The golden rule, the human dignity idea here to say, well, we'll just talk about the things that bring us together. We'll ignore the things that are different about that. Karen Armstrong's Charter of Compassion, based on the common golden rule approaches in so many faith groups, was an example of that. But in the end, however, we must be cautious about approaches which obviate the need to learn more fully of both similarities and differences of very faiths with which we dialogue and work with in coalition. With all of these approaches, our ability to work together must never come at the price of silencing our concerns, even our criticisms, where we feel in good conscience they must be raised. The challenge is, can we agree to work together on what we agree on, even while we hold respectful differences on important issues where we agree to disagree? Then there is a deeper, richer form of pluralism, where we're willing to open ourselves to learn about the very truth claims of our dialogical partners, where we see working on common projects as an indispensable way of building trust and confidence among groups who are different. We're not only learning about, but experiencing the lived religious lives of our dialogical partners, the religious holidays, celebrations, ceremonies where participation does not violate our religious constraints, where we can, with love and respect, agree to disagree, and where lifting up common ground based on fulsome knowledge of differences is a strategy, not an end in itself. This requires a deep commitment to achieving a degree of religious literacy, again raising the issue of civic education, where we learn about other religions and don't force our own truth claims on others. Again, Chris Seipel, Dennis Hoover, Chris Stewart, whom I mentioned before, call this approach covenantal pluralism, an idea that resonates as well in the writings of two significant contemporary Jewish thinkers, the late revered Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, and the influential Orthodox Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg. Allow me to address the concept of religious pluralism in general and covenantal pluralism in particular, speaking from the perspective of a rabbi as to how Judaism thinks about these issues. A position I want to put forward simply as a model for you to think about how does your own faith tradition think about these ideas. Ideas relevant to the concept of religious pluralism include a number of essential Jewish values and historical lessons of universal application to all people, including those of varied religions, or of Jewish legal guidance to the interactions between Jew and non-Jew. Let me explain what I mean. I'll name 4 of them. 1, I mentioned already, the infinite value of each person, rooted in a belief that every human being is created in the image of the divine and endowed with inherent human dignity, that all of us have the spark of an idea of the divine within us. It is an idea shared by the most Christian traditions as well. Second, the fundamental equality of all people connected with the above concept of value and dignity of each human being. These equality concepts are rooted as well in the stories central to the Jewish tradition, commenting on the Bible, what we call the Midrash, or the Agadah, the non-legal components of the Jewish tradition. Why are we all descended from one couple in the stories of the Bible, the Midrash asks? Why was Adam made from the dust of the 4 corners of the earth? So none of us can claim that the merit of our ancestors is greater than the merit of anyone else. We are all descended from the same couple. In the Quran, the same point is made, a variant of the same story. We are all equal before God. We are all truly brothers and sisters. Or as a text of an influential medieval Jewish compilation, Yalkut Shimoni observes, I call heaven and earth to witness that whether one be Gentile or Jew, man or woman, slave or free man, the divine spirit rests on each in accordance with their deeds. Third, freedom of choice as inhering in the human condition, one of Judaism's most significant contributions to Western thought, and of course, a foundational belief associated with freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. No ideas of predestination, no ideas of fates that play games with human destiny, but I've set before you this day the blessing and the curse, life and death, good and evil. I can tell you which you should choose and why. But ultimately, if my word is to live on earth, God is in essence saying to us, it will be because of the choices you make. Therefore, choose life, that you and your children after you might live. Fourth, the biblical laws reflecting the treatment of the stranger, the ger, or the resident alien, the Talmudic idea of Mipnei Darchei Shalom, that wherever Jews and non-Jews live together, the stranger, the non-Jew, should be ensured the civil protections and social benefits that the Jew is entitled to. Mipnei Darchei Shalom, for the sake of the ways of peace in our society. And out of these ideas flowed over the centuries crucial concepts. First, the belief in Judaism that we don't have the only truth path to God. Sometimes this was addressed in terms of discussion of access to salvation or to heaven or the world to come in other strands of the Jewish tradition, which were more uncertain about life after death and held that doing good in the world is done for its own sake. It was expressed in terms of the moral status of equally ethical people who hold differing theological views. Is an ethical person who is not Jewish and believes in God morally equal to ethical God-believing Jews? Does someone who rejects the belief in God but is equally ethical have the same moral status as a God believer, whether in this world or in the world to come? One can believe that other religions are wrong in many regards, yet still affirm what is valid in them. Brandeis University professor Reuven Kimmelman has written on the subject of truth in religion and the importance of recognizing that no religion holds all truths and many may embody some truths. This is the Jewish view. You may come from a faith tradition that believes you do have all of the truth here, but that's the Jewish view, that no one tradition has all of the truth. The alternative is a principled pluralism, he writes, not relativism. It opposes relativism as it opposes absolutism. It affirms the human capacity for making truth claims. One can even legitimately claim a greater truth of one's religion, but having more truth is not tantamount to having all truth. That is God's alone, having all truth. Awareness of the pluralism of truth safeguards against exaggerated claims and religious smugness, he writes. It allows for the existence of competing visions of truth where there is a commonality of goals and a commitment to grow in truth. Or as Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg has urged, we have not yet grasped the richness of God's covenantal pluralism. God's covenantal pluralism. Pluralism means more than accepting or even affirming the other. It entails recognizing the blessing in the other's existence because it balances one's own position, because it brings us all closer to the ultimate goal. Even when we are right in our position, the other who contradicts our position may be our corrective or our check against going to excess. Maimonides, the famous authoritative medieval scholar, wrote, "Any who accept upon themselves and carefully accept the 7 Noahide commandments is of the righteous of the nations of the world and has a portion in the world to come." This is the late Jonathan Sacks said in The Dignity of Difference, which I'm sure many of you have read. If you haven't, I can't commend it more enthusiastically to you. One God, creator of diversity, commands us to honor God's creation by respecting diversity. Again, the Quran makes a similar point. "O people, we created you all from a single man and a single woman and made you into races and tribes so that you should get to know one another." I note that Islamic thought on these issues is yet another of our roundtables this year. During the Mishnaic period, again, when Jesus of Nazareth taught, the tradition affirmed that the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. And the very famous and influential German Orthodox Jewish philosopher, 18th century, Moses Mendelssohn, the father of Bartholdy Mendelssohn, the composer, who sought to reconcile Age of Reason and traditional Jewish philosophies, argued that the ethical person of any or no religious belief who found morality and ethics by way of reason alone could also find a path to salvation. In modern times particularly, but not exclusively in the non-Orthodox streams, like my own, more have embraced this interpretation as well. Among the varied outcomes of covenantal pluralism and a rich pluralism are hopes that deeper understanding and respect for truth claims, not ours, and that we do not share and we may even think are wrong, holds out hope for working together in broad coalitions, for a more just society, a more peaceful and better world. As Rabbi Sacks writes in his book, The Home We Build Together, what then is society? It is where we set aside all considerations of wealth and power and value people for what they are and what they give. It is where Jew, Christian, Muslim and Hindu, Buddhist and Sikh can come together, bound by their commonalities, enlarged by their differences. It is where we join in civil conversation about the kind of society we wish to create for the sake of our grandchildren, not yet born. It is where we share an overarching identity, a first language of citizenship, despite our different second language of ethnicity or faith. It is where strangers can become friends. It is not a vehicle of salvation. It is the most effective form yet devised for a respectful coexistence. Society is a home we build together when we bring our several gifts to the common good. This, above all, is the power of covenantal pluralism. In the process that helps transform ideas, engagement, and cooperation into a society functioning at its best. But always we must remember that religious pluralism cannot exist without our acting to ensure religious freedom for all. So to the students in this year's program, how can you help with this vital effort? For I really believe you also have an indispensable role. There is much needed research on religious freedom going on right here at BYU in ICLARS and the Wheatley programs at other colleges and universities around the country. Faculty and students can help us better understand how religious freedom impacts and is impacted by national security, stability, prosperity, economic growth and economic crisis, conflict resolution, countering violent extremism, and other related issues of vital importance to our domestic and foreign policy formulations. Second, you'll be working out of your roundtables on projects that will not only deepen your understanding of these issues, but has been the case in past years, projects that may grow and morph into real programs that make a difference. I also encourage you, finally, to consider a career in public service or nonprofits within your faith community or outside of it, dedicated to the work of what in Judaism we call tikkun olam, transforming and healing our broken world. For as daunting as the challenges I have discussed tonight may be, let us also recognize and celebrate that we live at a time of hope of which our ancestors, our prophets, our sages throughout the ages could only have dreamed. We may indeed face perilous, unprecedented problems, but paradoxically, we may well be the first generation of humanity living in a world capable of creating the kind of just, peaceful, compassionate society that our history and our values charge us to build and have charged us to build from the very beginning of our faith traditions. For we are the first generation that actually produces enough food to feed every human being on earth. The failure to do so now is a failure of moral vision and political will. We're the first generation that can conquer malaria and an array of diseases that have plagued humanity from time immemorial. A failure to do so is a failure of moral vision and political will. We're the first generation that can educate every child on earth, can lift up every person out of poverty, can undo the damage in our environment before it is too late, can spread freedom across the globe. For all of these, our failure to do so is a failure of moral vision and political will. Well, we know what we must do to succeed. Enhance the spiritual fulfillment that can transform people for the better, empower individuals, institutions, and community to organize to meet their needs and act assertively in coalition with like-minded communities to change government policies to embody our vision of justice. Any one of those without the others will lead to failure. And in all these issues, what I've learned so clearly in my nearly 50 years of religious and moral advocacy to government and society is that someone will decide. And our only choice is whether we will be the audience watching others make those decisions, or if we will be the authors of those decisions. And this I tell you with certainty. If you remain silent, in the vacuum of your silence will come voices that do not share your values, your dreams, your aspirations. As Dr. King said in his remarkable Riverside Church speech on Vietnam, we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic epitaph, too late. 3 weeks from now, we will celebrate Purim. It is a Jewish holiday that tells the story in the Bible of Esther. You remember those remarkable verses in the book of Esther where Mordecai beseeches his niece Esther to lobby her husband, King Ahasuerus, on behalf of her people? At first she demurs. And Mordecai challenges her with two questions. First, he asks, if your people are destroyed, do you think you will be safe? So too for every human being today. In this ever-shrinking world, if human beings anywhere suffer insult or injury, injustice or oppression, who among us think we ourselves in the long run will be safe? And make no mistake about it, the kind of potential for destruction by climate change, by nuclear weapons I talked about, there will be no Noah's Ark that will keep us safe. Mordecai then urges Esther to have courage, saying, who knows whether your elevation to the royal house, to access and power and influence, was not for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Might not we see the unprecedented freedom given us in the most influential country in the world, a blessing granted us for just such a time as this? The Midrash, those interpretations of the Bible, then comments that this remarkable woman lobbyist, Queen Esther, I don't know between Antigone and Queen Esther who came first, so Queen Esther may be the first here, decides she will engage in this advocacy on behalf of the values and interests of her people and observes, I shall go then, and God shall lend me God's right hand and left hand with which the universe was created. It's a stunning image. This is the only time in the interpretations, the Jewish interpretations of this biblical story, that, or anywhere, that I found this image. Often stories anthropomorphize God, saying God does this with God's left hand or God's right hand, but only in going to plead for justice to the king do we find the image that our hands are the hands of God. My friends, when you lean down to feed a hungry child, your hands are doing God's work. They are the hands of God. When you march for racial equality, for religious freedom, your legs are the legs of God. As Rabbi Heschel said in Selma, I felt like my legs were praying. When you turn your eyes to injustice that others would ignore, your eyes are the eyes of God. When you listen where others turn away, your ears are the ears of God. When you speak out against hatred and intolerance and bigotry and persecution, your voice is the voice of God. And when you work day in and day out, as so many of you do, in so many ways, to feed the hungry, clothe the poor, raise up the downtrodden, educate the child, care for the sick and the elderly, your work is doing God's work here on earth. And this is the very work that we are called to do. And this I know above all. With all of the problems and all of the mistakes that we have made, we are not the prisoners of the bitter mistakes of our past. Our faith traditions, all of them teach us we can be, we must be, we will be the shapers of a better and more hopeful future for our children and children's children, indeed, for all God's children. Thank you.
We have time for just a few questions from the audience, and we'd like to prioritize student questions.
So who's going to start us off? As soon as usually one person goes, then others follow. So who wants to start us off? I want to open it beyond the students.
Right here.
What is your opinion on...
And I'm sorry, we have a microphone over here that will help with streaming. So if you could just dash over there, that'd be great. Thank you.
What is your opinion on interfaith apologetic enterprises? Do they do more harm than good, or are they a necessary thing to have? What's your opinion on that?
Could you explain it a little bit more? You used the phrase apologetic enterprises. I'm not
Yeah,
sure
so just-
to what that's alluding.
So just discussing maybe the contradictions or disagreements of truth claims between different religions. Does that help with the religious climate, or does that do more harm than good, in your opinion?
Yeah, here, I truly believe, there are different ways of having discussions about profound differences. And, here I come back to Martin Buber. I did my rabbinic thesis on Martin Buber's political theory. Buber, calls for what is an I-thou relationship, to recognize the presence of the divine in every human being and the presence of a common humanity and part of creation here. This idea of our all being a part of creation had to be recognized. When you speak to people in that spirit, when you speak to people, the kind of golden rule, don't do unto others, or do unto others as you want them to do to you, don't do others to others as they wouldn't want them to do. Jewish versions do not do, and the Christian version, positive variant of it. And in every faith tradition is wording one way or the other similar to that, raising the same thing. It talks about our responsibility to others, and part of that is the way we have dialogue. And dialogue is crucially important about this. I think when you bury differences, they come out in unhealthy ways. They lead you to feel that I just don't understand why they do what they do here. They feel strange and the other to me. Where I think if we discussed things that are different about the way other faith traditions live their lives, and we understand why, we may not say we may say that's not for us, that violates my religious tenets here, but we understand at least what they do and why they do that here. So, I think there's no guarantee it can be done right and it can be done wrong. You do anything wrong, and it's going to be counterproductive. But I think this kind of pluralism with deep religious literacy, a willingness to invest to really learn about the other traditions, and I would hope in a civic community we are teaching about religions in general. Because and Mormons were the victim of this for a long period of time. It was for so many people a strange religion here. But what it says about America with all of our problems, just think about this. It used to be when they asked those questions every election, would you vote for a Catholic, an evangelical, a Protestant, a mainline Protestant, a Jew, a Mormon, a Muslim, an atheist here? For decades, Jews and Mormons and Muslims and atheists were way, way down the list. Here, Catholics also below first mainline Protestants and then evangelical Protestants. Today, Jews and Catholics score above anyone else and have for over a decade. And Mitt Romney changed the perception of what it meant for a Mormon to be president and made it a comfortable idea for many people. And those attitudes are changing. So, I think those differences can be overcome by knowledge about each other and the willingness to work together and not just talk. When you work together on common problems, you build trust in ways that just talking can't do. So,
thank you.
Another question here. And let us know your name, too. Come forward.
Yeah, what was your name?
I'm Liz. I'm a student at Brigham Young University.
Thank you.
My name is Victoria. I know that you mentioned previously that 80% of the population of the world live in a place with religious persecution and suppression. Are you confident about U.S. future of being like one of those countries because of how the climate is going? And what kind of suggestions would you give to our students? Like how can we preserve this freedom in this difficult, in this difficult political environment?
Crucial question. I'm really glad that you asked it. This is an extraordinarily troubling moment. First of all, that statistic about 80%, it's often misunderstood. Note the language that both you used and I used about that. We use the same language, which is 80% of the population of the world lives in countries that have severe violations of religious freedom. That's not to say that 80% of the population suffers from that, because almost always it's minority groups. So Hindus in India don't particularly have a problem. Buddhists in Myanmar don't have a problem here. It's the minority groups that have a problem. Of course, in America, we are seeing enormous demographic changes here. In 2008, again, similar to what I was talking about with to the group at lunch today about the Blue Dog Democrats. In 2008, 2012, 56% of Americans identified as white Christians. Today, it's 44%. Now, there are still majority whites and majority Christians, but white Christians as the group that was a normative power group in American culture, politics, economics, et cetera, is a radically changing country. And so when a presidential candidate claimed, I want to make America great again, it was saying, I want to restore kind of what you knew growing up. And we're never going back there. We're not going back there for economic reasons. We're not going back there for demographic reasons. If what that means is that the kind of positive aspects that people have recollections of their rights being protected as workers and being better off before the economic upheavals here changed so much of industries, and particularly the manufacturing industries, and people need to be reassured in new structures to do it, then I hope both parties would agree. That when, for instance, candidate Trump called for that, that's something people can work in together here. But insofar as going back to the way it was, this country's changed forever in this regard. And people are scared when the world they know is changing here. And that provides the fertile field, that ground I was talking about before, in which blame, the victim kind of mentality can take hold here. So this is really a problem here. So, what can we do about it? Again, building the kind of interfaith, there are interfaith coalitions in virtually every single community in America. We forget how common this is. It is simply part of the fabric of America. Lifting those up, legitimizing them, raising their profile, building them out, training people to build them out is crucially important. Setting up efforts, it is true that people tend to join the congregations that are most like them culturally, politically, et cetera. But still, more than any other institution in the country, our churches are comprised of people with differing political views. We can help model what respectful civil discourse will be. I do a lot of training with our rabbis, explaining, when a rabbi's giving a sermon and they want to address issues, there are ways to acknowledge the differing views that exist in the congregation, to give voice to a differing view before you give your conclusion of what you believe and why. That empowers them. Or offering to have other views with differing viewpoints be heard in the congregation, even while you give your viewpoint, can often offset some of the angst that people feel. I'm an outsider here because my rabbi is too conservative, too liberal on political issues. That's not where I am. And that's replayed in every faith group. And there are a lot of techniques we can use to actually model what respectful discourse might be. So the religious communities of America play a role in that as well. But I think what's also important is our standing up and calling hatred for what it is when we hear it here, and doing it in a tone of not aiming to characterize the person, but to characterize the message here, and to reach out to the person here to try and help them understand the pain that their comments might be causing, et cetera. Will it always work? No. Will it mostly work? Perhaps not. Does it work sometimes? Yes. And if sometimes happens enough, it actually can tip the balance of things in the country as well. So some of the observation on this.
Thank you so much.
David, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a delightful evening. And
can I offer just one last observation
Yes.
from my mentor, Al Vorspan, who, because I've given somewhat of a challenging message here, and I know it, he used to observe, the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that an optimist argues this is the best of all possible worlds, and a pessimist agrees. There. We all tend to be the eternal optimists here, and we have to take that message of hope out there with confidence and assertiveness that this agenda is truly the agenda that God is calling us to do. So thank you.
amen. Thank you so much. We are so inspired. Thank you for joining us this evening. The students who and our roundtable leaders and others that are planning to go up to Aspen Grove, stick with us here. Gather around the podium here. We have some announcements about some logistical issues that will take place in the next little while. So Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.